Okay, we're going to get started. We got a good, healthy 20 people, and I'm sure they'll continue to come on as we get started here. Welcome, everybody, to the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section. Hangtime, grapevines to wines. I don't call it lunch hour anymore. That was a great idea in the beginning, but in some parts of the country, it's very early still. So I hope
and in Italy, it's 5 p.m.
And in Italy, it's 5 p.m. That's right. So thank you, Marco, for almost joining us after hours. My name is Nathan Eason. I serve as a board member on the ASEV Eastern Section Board. It's been a pleasure serving the past couple of years. And something that came about is, again, this Hangtime session about just having more opportunity to showcase ASEV. If you're not familiar with it, we encourage you to go check out the website. It's just ASEV-ES in Google, at least. I think it's .org. But anyway, it should be easy enough to find. We do have an annual conference, and it's about academia getting together and graduate students and the research that's being done across the nation and sharing it with each other at our conference. Well, not everybody can make our conference. So this hang time is a great opportunity to take professionals and scholarly work and the body of knowledge and have an opportunity to share it. So that's my introduction of ASEV. So again, check it out if you've not been a part of it, and share it with your friends. It's a great organization to be a part of, because what we realize, and apparently it's not even nationally, it's globally, right, Marco, where we all have problems and that we face similar challenges, and why even to areas of the globe that grow grapes better than some areas and regions that we're attempting to grow them in, there's still the same principles that apply. And that's what I love about it. We're going to look at similarities. And Miss Kendra here's she's all the way in California, but she's going to showcase diseases and dieback and wood rot and different things that they face as well. So without further ado, I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves. So we'll start with ladies first. And Miss Kendra, if you'll introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Kendra Baumgartner. I'm a plant pathologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in Davis, California. I study grapevine trunk diseases. I also study armillaria root rot of primarily on prunus, and in California, our big stone fruit crop is, or prunus crop, is almonds.
Thank you. Marco.
Okay, this is my turn. So I'm Marco Tessari. I'm speaking from Italy, northeast of Italy, close to Vado from a viticultural point of view. I'm specialized into pruning and teaching crews how to prune and how to shape the vine and build a beautiful canopy. And I would say in relation also to keep the vine healthy with the pruning wounds that we need to do, but we try to do in the less harmful way. So if you agree, I will start, and maybe I even share the screen with all of you. Okay, so.
And by the way, Marco, right before you get started, I do want to tell our audience, I did forget this minor thing. If you have questions, this is an interactive discussion-based platform. So if you have questions, you can, if you want to audibly ask, you can do the little raise your hand icon at the bottom. That will send your name to the top of the chat list. Or the participant list, and I'll unmute you. Otherwise, everybody's muted. Or if you want to type in a question, there's the Q&A box at the bottom that you type in that question. Please, please, please go ahead and throw those questions out as we go through this information. And we're just going to have some conversation. This is not just a presentation for one person, but just discussing all the things together. All right, go ahead, Margaret, take it off.
Okay, so I had the chance to work quite around the world, Europe, Italy especially, and United States, of course, and in Australia. And from a pruning perspective point of view, I have really seen that there are common patterns. Today, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures mainly focus on cordon, that is more common in the United States. But the point is really, everybody needed to prune their vines, so to make some cuts. There is a huge difference in the long term if you do good cuts or if you do bad cuts. If you do bad cut, for example, on top of a cordon, and here I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that maybe you're familiar with or maybe you're not. These cuts that are huge on top of the vine really struggle to heal them, okay? And then Kendra will discuss about on how we have to see from a practical point of view on how every cut, it is actually a door for the pathogens. So less cut we do and less the surface we expose to those pathogens, the better it is for the vine. The pattern of deterioration of a cordon is we make a bad cut on top of the cordon. We start to lose position. This picture, they were made in Tuscany, Italy. This picture, they were took in Virginia. So just to say that there is no shame into bad pruning, it is kind of all around the world. The interesting thing, it is that where there are the cuts, we can see that there is really like a door for, of course, desiccation, but in many cases, like where I'm showing you now, some pathogens. Which one? It is difficult to say, but let's say that from pruning perspective, we know that we are opening the door. I go quickly. Many times an arm becomes so bad that we think, okay, I'm going to chop it, retrain it, and I mean, happy days. It's not always like that, because when we chop the arm of a cordon, that sometimes we need to do, we are actually opening a very big wound that is another big door for the pathogens. This is the arm, for example, that has been chopped out, and we can see on this one how clearly the cutting region are the door for those pathogens. Again, even where we made a big cut to recreate the cordon, it was a source for pathogen too. I know that now I am scaring you a little bit, and I will, but I mean, this is a reality. So when we make a cut, when the people who works for you, who makes cut, they need to have an awareness that it is not, it can be a dangerous process if done not correctly and into the correct windows of opportunity. This, for example, is another, this is another example from Italy, okay, in Tuscany, just to say that there is really, it is spread all around the world with different pathogens. Kendra will talk about it, but all the time from the field perspective, I have seen making this section that the point of entrance, it is the actual wound that can be cut, machine wound, whatever. I go quickly to end my little speech of introduction to saying that there is a different way to do things, because when we are first a little lucky, but when we can make cuts that are small and respecting the physiology of the vine, we actually we can have a very different situation in terms of, as you can see into this picture, an healthy trunk without the presence of and the infection of the pathogens. So just to finish the story into a positive way, for the experience that I made around the world, vine who are pruned and who has no many wounds, they can live a lot. These are let's say, wonderful example, a special example, and I always hope that your vineyard can live 100 years old. I doubt that, but this is like a hopeful message. And so the goal of my speech today, it is to say that a vineyard that, as it is pruned, respecting the physiology and not making big cuts, has many more chances to survive and to how to say, to become a very a vine who has a long life and many good vintages.
Absolutely.
This was it.
Thank you, Marco. And that's, so it delves in. So everybody attending this can agree, we have to make a wound. Some people call it pruning, but you're wounding the plant. It's to increase fruit production. It's to set fruit, set your yields. It's to rejuvenation pruning. There's different types of pruning. Some people do cane pruning. Some people do spur pruning. They're on different cultivars, different varieties are going to act differently. Across the country, we have the European varieties as well as the hybrids, and those are going to act differently at times. And so one thing when I look at as a nation, the industry, I mean, besides kind of Napa Valley, the industry is new. It's so new, and we're in all the land grant universities applying pruning research on the East Coast all the way up to cold environments to the South, are looking at how these vines are going to react. But the fact is, at the end of the day, we do have grapes in the ground. We know we have to prune them. So we're making this wound. So Kendra, walk us into, we've got a wound. As Marco showed, we have two things. One happened is desiccation. So that's just the wound trying to heal itself and close that wound. But talk to us about the concerns that we have to have when it's open.
For sure. Well, the trunk pathogen, the fungi that cause trunk diseases make their spores with rain. And studies that have been done in a few places, mostly Mediterranean climates like California and parts of Europe, have shown that wounds are susceptible to infection after pruning all throughout the dormant season. Some of the studies we've done on trapping the fungi that cause trunk diseases show that there's a whole range of different fungi making spores all throughout the dormant season. It isn't like they all make their spores in December or January or February or March. Some of them continue to sporulate with rain all winter long, winter for us. Others will sporulate all through December, and when the days are shorter, and as the days get longer, they different ones will take their turn, so to speak. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is there's always a risk from something when it's raining. So probably one of the best things you can do to minimize the risk of infection is to just prune when dry weather is forecasted.
Yeah, and that's one thing that as we prepared talking about these things, I'm going to call these windows. And when we think about pruning and managing these vines, there's lots of different windows. There's weather windows, there's frost windows. And so in the end, I'd like to, for our audience, maybe, think about these windows as a reference of decision making. And I think your point right now is you kept saying rain, rain, rain. And so if global warming or global climate change is real, and we are seeing warmer trends, we can have a warm summer, we can have a mild summer. Not only are we thinking about those fungi pathogens, but we're thinking about Pierce's disease and things like that across the South, having issues with control of Pierce's disease on these mild winters. So what you're telling us, Kendra, is that you're never safe. Is that right?
Yes, there's some things making spores that could potentially infect a pruning wound. I would say, though, that many of these fungi do not seem to sporulate with rain during the growing season so much. It might be early in the growing season, in the springtime during bud break for some of them, but their period of sporulation seems to be more restricted to winter time in Mediterranean climates and potentially in springtime in cooler growing regions. And all the wounds that are made to the canopy during the growing season, maybe for shoot thinning. I mean, you think about, not only are you wounding the vine during pruning, but there's a ton of wounds that go on with canopy management all during the growing season. However, when the vine is actively growing, it's thought to be better to defend itself against infections from the pathogens that cause trunk diseases if they do happen to make spores during the growing season with rain.
So
I think this is something really important because one of the aspects that I stress a lot to try to minimize the wounds in winter, it is to be really thorough and to spend the time to do shoot thinning, especially when the shoots are on an early stage of growth. It will be easy to remove them, and the wound on the trunk, it will be, I would say, minimal. So, Kendra, good to know that it is a good practice also you emphasize that it is a good practice to maybe to remove the shoots in spring instead than to make a lot of cuts into the winter.
Yeah, whatever you can do to minimize cuts is the best strategy. And I think too that, it's not really, for many years, we recommended to growers to delay pruning, to prune as late as possible in the dormant season, because the vines are thought to heal faster. And thus they have a shorter period of susceptibility as we get through the dormant season and bud break approaches. However, that's less and less practical over time, just from an ag labor standpoint. Here in California, the labor laws really changed recently, where any amount of time spent over 40 hours a week is considered overtime, and that really changed things overnight for activities like pruning and harvest, which are the most expensive vineyard practices all year long.
Marco, one of the things that after sitting in one of your classes, the takeaway for me was you're managing wounds, but you're also the size of the wound. Infection is infection. Correct me wrong, Kendra, no matter the size of the wound. But we do agree physiologically that a smaller wound heals quicker. Therefore, one thing about Marco's classes is he talks about, if you're taking that cordon off, don't take it right up next to the head. Come out, make a first cut back here. You can still start laying down your new cordon, but don't go all the way back, and allow that desiccation and potential infection that's in there to potentially dry up. And then at a later date, you can remove that at a more appropriate time. That's the dried wood. Marco, you want to kind of expound?
Yes, it is. I mean, you are talking about something that ideally we would not like to get into. So I know that is a catchy argument, like to discuss about how to make like surgery to remove part of a cordon that maybe it is infected, and yes, it is a good practice to leave some buffer wood for to have some space for the vine to try to enact the natural resources that the vine has to stop pathogens. But again, I will, for let's say a general audience, try to really stress the concept that if we prune correctly, if we prune, like Kendra said, trying to, I mean, this discussion is 1 hour, it can go much longer than that, but because there are so many factors, so much that we don't know, but the few things that we know, so to do less less wounds, to have less surface of these wounds, to avoid the rain that can be also a factor of that increase the pathogen spread. If you follow these, let's say, good pruning rules, maybe you have to cut and make the big cuts to rejuvenate the vine. I mean, I always try to see it as something that ideally we would like to avoid. And actually, this can be also, I mean, talking about bufferwood, Kendra, I think it can be connected to the idea of pre-pruning. Like we know that from labor point of view and timing point of view, and I'm thinking about especially on cordon, it is good to pre-prune the vine, so by hand or by machine, so to make a first cut that will allow you to remove the top cane, for example, and then go to do the final pruning with calm and precision. And tell me if there is something to know about it in terms of infection and if it is safe or not.
I would say that the way that the infection happens is the spores, you know, when you cut the surface of or when you make a pruning cut, the spores are so tiny that they fall inside the xylem vessels that are in there. So the xylem vessels have a greater diameter than are the size of the spores, more or less, for most of these fungi. And so they fall into these what look like tubes that are all cut on end. And those tubes are of different lengths. Grapevines have these incredibly long vessels compared to most plants. You know, some of them can be a meter or two long. But the spores actually germinate inside those tubes. And so, but what we found, which is kind of interesting when we do our inoculations of plants in the greenhouse for doing our studies, we find that the node is kind of a spot where the pathogens don't tend to move quite as well beyond that. So when we do our inoculations in the greenhouse, we try to train our plants to have a single woody stem. And we always inoculate kind of 1/2 inch below the stem. We drill a hole in the side of the vine. That's our pruning wound. And we pipette the fungus in there. And then, you know, the next node down, some of these fungi that grow quickly might grow 2 inches in a year, you know, 4 inches in a year at most. And that's maybe 1 or 2 of them. The majority of them grow very little. And the vine does stop these infections. You know, they don't like march their way through the entire cordon and down the trunk and down to the soil line. The vine can limit the infections to some extent. But the node seems to be important at stopping it. I mean, the problem is that while these are relatively localized infections, they're localized on fruiting positions where you need shoots to form and fruit to form. So yeah, I would say that they're not as much of a risk. One infection alone cannot kill an entire vine. It will not spread systemically throughout an entire vine, but where it is localized can cause a lot of damage because a fruiting position is critical for growing the crop on the grapevine, right?
We have a question.
Yes,
Go ahead. Well, I have a quick question. It says when cane pruning, when is cane pruning, is it best to cut as far away from the node as possible? Does this allow the vine to wall off at the node prior to the fungi growing that far in? So I think you somewhat answered that. Still, is that
I would say that's a pretty good guess. Yes, that leaving a long cane, so to speak, longer than you normally would allow the vine to heal that properly, such that the fungus wouldn't get all the way into, I guess it would be the head of the vine, right, on a cane prune vine.
Sure.
I
Go ahead.
will add that I will not say that cane pruning is safer than cordon pruning, because there are many factors into this. Of course, into a cordon there are potentially more source of infection. If you think like you have one spur here, and many other spurs. But another factor it is that if you think that wounds are the position where the pathogens start to crawl into the trunk, okay, the positive factor of a cordon it is that you have more trunk for the pathogens to crawl in before to get actually to the roots of the vine, which is where you have no other chances to rejuvenate or retract. So cane and cordon have different, let's say, aspect in terms of also the pruning and the infection position, and I've seen that both they can be positive or negative if treated not properly.
When we think about, Mark, the lessons that you take, you talk about from vine year 1 to leaf 2 to leaf 3, training that vine and managing that growth year by year by year, never letting anything getting bigger than a pencil width of a pruning wound. We should all put away the loppers, put away the saws.
Of course,
should,
yeah, absolutely.
And for here in the South anyway, and I'll speak for this, and anybody else in the audience, feel free to speak up about your region, but we may, because of some trunk dieback, need and just voided, open deadwood on the arms, need to do a rejuvenation. So that does require that reestablishing a new cordon arm. And a lot of times I like the concept of you kind of run that arm out of energy when those buds start pushing. If you already have your new cordon down, you can almost exhaust all the energy going to that. And again, trying to get that to it's a multi-year cut from what I learned from your class. And that would be the only reason we here in the South or on the East Coast potentially would need to make a big wound, is for that rejuvenation cutting.
Yes, there are, in fact, many factors that brings us to saws or lopper. One, it is of course the pathogens that kills the actual structure of the vine, so we need to grow it again. The other factor is that if we don't prune the vine a little bit with a little bit of chess strategy to think where my vine will be next year and where it will be the following year and so, and like to avoid the vine to grow too quickly. If the vine grows too quickly, we have to bring it back, especially modern viticulture where we have spaces and canopy that is really well defined. So yes, the best strategy is to start from year 1 to train a beautiful trunk, and then the cordons, and then to grow all the position year by year, a little by a little. If we mismanage this process, the vine grows too fast, and then we have not enough canopy, so we need to retain a shoot, and then we use the lopper, big cut, big door for the pathogens, blah, blah, blah. And so, yes, ideally, we like to avoid cuts from the first year and try to do less and less year by removing the shoot, making small cuts. Actually, another thing, how do you call the... Okay, at the base of the vine, something that many times we neglect, even the wounds that we make at the base of the vine with the, how do you call it? The suckers? No, the suckers. I'm thinking about when you trim the grass, for example.
Weed eaters.
Oh, mowers.
Exactly. Also, those that are not pruning wounds can be source of infection. Am I correct?
Yeah, you can get wounds on the trunk, whether they're cuts to remove suckers or damage from any sort of implement. Those can get infected too. I mean, any permanent woody part of the vine can get infected by the pathogens that cause trunk diseases. And of course, the trunk infection would be most damaging, right? Because there's no kind of chance to grow, healthy tissues above that if it's a really severe infection.
One thing
Yes.
I want to move on to say timing. So people do two types of pruning. Like Marco said, sometimes they come in at the second guide wire, lop it off with hedgers, remove the large component of that vine from the previous year's growth, and then they can come through and make a final prune closer to spring. Of course, universities have done a lot of work on this and different varieties depending on delayed bud break. A lot of times, if we see those apical dominant buds at the end of those shoots that we left 7 to 12 buds on, that is enough to overwinter, but eventually we're going to make a final cut. But if we wait until the springtime to make that final cut, we've seen here in Georgia that delay can be, if we wait too long, we could have adverse effects on getting those basal buds and those first and secondary buds, not secondary buds, those lower position buds to push the ones that we want, that we've actually left them too long. So during that delayed pruning, I want to keep in mind the pathology. So we have somebody asking a question about, or saying spraying trichoderma after making a cut is advisable, or using something like a spur shield. There's a lot of times questions about if you're making that final cut and we actually already have sap flow pushing, you make that cut and it waters up, got a nice little meniscus of water of sap there. Is it still advisable to make spray coverage on the fungicide sprays on those wounds, even though it's pushing so hard? Is it pushing the product off the plant? And I'll tell you, I'll be upfront and honest. I've asked this question before, and I think every specialist that I've talked to is too scared to say don't spray it because we always want to cover our tails. But Kendra, I didn't know if you had a thought on that.
Well, I guess it depends on how widespread that is. Some vineyards, when you're going through and pruning, you'll see, a couple wounds here and there kind of bleeding, so to speak. And then as the closer you get towards bud break, though, during the pruning season, the higher and higher percentage of cuts like that you will see. I mean, from a dosage standpoint, if you're applying like a fungicide, anything that dilutes it from the dosage that's supposed to hit every pruning wound will minimize the efficacy of that product. So yeah, the longer you wait to prune and you see that the pruning wounds bleeding, I would say there is a risk of whatever product you're putting on those of it being diluted and thus less effective. I mean, however, I might argue that, if the vines are starting to come out of dormancy, their wounds might be healing a little bit faster anyways, and thus the period of wound susceptibility after you've cut those wounds might be very short, days at that point.
Sure. And I just want to, again, open up to our audience. If anybody has questions, raise your hand and I'll unmute you. You can ask our panelists questions, or feel free to type them in.
And I did want to respond to the comment by Neat C. Thank you, about spraying a pruning wound protectant after pruning. I would say that there isn't a lot of really good evidence that spur shield is very effective against a broad range of the fungi that cause trunk diseases. The evidence really isn't there that it does a great job of protecting them. I would say there's more and more evidence in support of Vitacil and the trichoderma containing product called Biotam. The advantage of Biotam, which is a biological control agent, it's trichoderma. It's another fungus that can get inside the wood. It doesn't cause disease. It's not a pathogen. but it can actually be a parasite of other fungi, which is kind of interesting. It can eat other fungi, it can kill them. But what it's supposed to mostly do, we think, is just kind of outcompete for space on the pruning wound after the cuts are made. And if trichoderma can colonize that wound, theoretically, then a pathogen will not. So that's the idea behind that. Vitacil offers promise that some of the fungicides that are labeled as pruning wound protectants in some states at least don't have, the fungicides like Topsin, is the trade name. The active ingredient is thiophanate methyl. Some other materials that we've tested that have pyraclostrobin in them, for example, those are effective, but they're not effective for very long. It may be a week or 10 days. And if it rains, they're less effective, right? Because that dilutes the product dosage. So Vitacil, in contrast, has the promise for being longer lasting, longer lived. And so it might work through a longer period of susceptibility that a fungicide, that's a chemical fungicide, might not.
I'm going to keep going down questions because sometimes the audience is shy. They're not being shy today. So we're going to keep going with to keep them interacted. If the wound is bleeding, can the spores still reach the xylem? So that's a spin on, does the fungicide reach the xylem? Is the actual spores, is it the same effect as it keeps the product off? It also keeps the spores out.
Yeah, good question. We don't know. I mean, the spores get in there just passively. They don't move actively, down against the flow of the xylem. So if you imagine when you make a cut through, a cane, and you've created all of these holes, so to speak, and then there's some amount of what we call cavitation, like the vine seals those off to some extent too. There's no more water that can flow all the way through. Wherever the spores land in there is where they might germinate. It would be the same, I guess, for the products, although I don't know how far they soak in, so to speak. It would just be through capillary action that different chemicals they're carried in water, would make their way down through there. But that's a good question. I don't think that anything you're spraying on a pruning wound is getting very far, though. It is just meant to be a protectant. And the protectants, like the fungicides I mentioned, Topsin and the pyraclostrobin containing fungicides, those work only after the fungi germinate. The spore has to germinate and start to grow in its vegetative stage, the fungal hypha it's called, for those fungicides to be active. So they don't kill the spores on contact. They prevent the fungus from growing after the spores germinate.
Now that's interesting. I didn't know that. So does that mean we need to actually delay our applications a day or two?
No, I mean, it's still good to have them out there because those materials will be effective for, a week or 10 days. Okay. In dry weather.
In dry weather, keynote
yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question
so again,
Marco?
Be careful on rain.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yes. Can you speak to methods to reduce the inoculum in the vineyard? I guess that goes to overall sanitation. What about Marco? You're talking about how often do we see pruners sanitize their pruners in between vines?
The pruners or the machine who are used, not a lot. And I can really say from a practical point of view, it becomes difficult to be able to sanitize the shears between the cuts, because the fact is that many times the vines, they have the pathogens inside, but they don't show it. And so how can we prune, start at, I don't know, 7, 8 in the morning and prune hundreds of vine a day and know which one it was which, and to go and to clean I mean, it is impractical, and I have seen some of it, but there is, I think, not even a great, I'm thinking about Tesca, there is not a great knowledge about those pathogens being spread by the shears. So I will not crash my head onto that problem.
And it's true, when we're cutting through infected wood, we're cutting through the vegetative stage of the fungus. And that's not how the fungus, these different pathogens spread. They spread by spores. The spores are what infect the pruning wounds. It's not the vegetative stage. So, you know, I guess also, if you think about sanitation in terms of like getting rid of infected vines, and it's an important way to prevent against the spread of some diseases, right? You get rid of the infected plants, and thus there isn't a local inoculum source within the vineyard. I don't know how practical that is. You know, if you were to go through a vineyard and cut and completely replant every vine that had a trunk disease, you know, there'd be no vineyards in California, you know,
in the world.
But they are a source of spores at some point, we think. I mean, I'm not 100% sure. Marco made an important point that the vine can kind of compartmentalize, we use this term compartmentalization. It can wall off and contain an infection inside the wood. And we don't know as scientists whether or not that means the fungus can make its way out to the surface of the bark and make spores at that point. You know, and that infection might stay there. It might be chronic. It might damage that small bit of the xylem, but does it contain the fungus permanently? You know, we don't really know that. But with some of these pathogens, for sure, they can infect pruning wounds, and then they can make spores within, you know, within another year, right? Like, so if you get an infection in winter, you don't prune away that wood, that infection gets established, that fungus can make spores on that infected spur the next year. And that's definitely the case for like the Botryopsferia dieback pathogens. Eutypa, not so much. It can take 3, 4, 5+ years to make spores after an infection. So, I mean, an infection might not lead to spores being produced in some cases. Yeah, I don't know. We don't have there are a lot of research questions in the study of these diseases, for sure.
Kendra, answer this. I mean, are these pathogens, they're already in nature? So
some of them can spread really far. Eutypa makes spores with rain, but the wind is what spreads Eutypa spores. All of the other fungi that cause trunk diseases, they spread by rain splash. So they don't spread very far. You know, if you think of rain droplets falling from the sky, and then they land on these little tiny fruiting structures that the fungi make, which are like the size of a pencil dot. If they hit those and there are spores being produced from there, then when the rain droplets splash away, they carry the spores with them.
Okay.
And so most of those will splash, so to speak, within 1 or 2 or at most 3 feet of where the fungus is making its spores. So it's very localized. Although, however, if you think of like one vine maybe having one spur that's infected, and then there are all these other pruning wounds around it, that vine is at high risk of infection by these fungi because all of the rain splash falls really close by that within that same vine canopy, so to speak.
So Sarah Bowman asked, do mescadines act the same way in this compartmentalization? She says that they like a diaphragm at the node.
It's a good question. You know, there's so little work that's been done with muscadine grapes when it comes to I guess anything other than bunch rots in terms of fungal pathogens of grapes. We haven't done many projects with muscadines. We've done, maybe in one of our studies, we did a vinifera muscadine hybrid of some sort that we inoculated. But yeah, we don't know. Really good question. It's a good point.
We can make a joke. I mean, after this, but it is true. We think to rule the world, but fungi are ruling the world more than us. They are all around. They are inside our vineyard, inside our vines. So really, when we in the vineyard, from a practical point of view, when we are trying to minimizing the factor of infection. We're trying to minimizing the factors of symptoms, okay, showing. For example, now I'm gonna share. I mean, I picked them during our conversation. Share the screen, okay. So an example of a vine. This one was in in Tuscany, Sangiovese vineyard, and a healthy vine. An old vine, actually with some branching and beautiful wood. The point is that I've seen that there was a couple of bad cuts on top, but I thought, okay, when we do the section, this vine should be okay, because even the canopy, the grapes, they were looking great. At the proof, let's say, of the chainsaw, I've seen what? I've seen that even those small bad cuts that there was on top of this beautiful branch that we can see, it has a lot of living wood. So another thing that I try to teach, it is that vines, and thank you, Kendra, for what you said, vine can live with the pathogens inside. So even to have a balance of a vine which has a lot of living wood, and so, like we say, a good storage for nutrients and so on, it can, for many years, live with the pathogens inside, but without showing the symptoms, which is our goal at the end, to have beautiful grapes, beautiful canes. So what I want to say, that don't think a vineyard like a laboratory, when we can, how can I avoid the infection? How can I really have no pathogens into my vineyard? It is really a little bit a futile battle in terms of not having anything. It is more a battle of management, diminishing the source of them, avoid the bad window that we talk about into this webinar, and to allow the vine to grow healthy and to live sometimes as we do as human beings. I mean, someone can have a bad elbow or something, but to live a long and happy life. And that is, let's say, one of the goals that we can achieve. So longevity, not into a sterile chamber without any pathogen. That can't happen.
All right, we got a question from Joey. Joey, I got you unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I was just curious if you guys have ever seen or experienced correlation between like higher planting densities and increased pathogen. I mean, just speaking to Kendra's point about the splash distance and all that, like, and in my experience, you know, some of the wider spacings just have less incidence of trunk diseases, to where some of the tighter spacings, you know, 5x3 or whatever, when you get an infection in those tighter spacings, it spreads quicker and becomes more of a problem. So just wanted to see if you guys had any observations on that.
Great question, Joey. Absolutely. Marco or Kendra, I'll let y'all take it away.
Yes, I have a couple of observations. The definitive answer, it will be, I don't know in which term. I can say to you, for example, that in Australia, where I worked, there were the vine the most the vine with the higher average age. I mean, I worked in field where there were all the vines older than 100 years old, and in the past they used to have vines who were more spread around. So Joey, this could be something that confirm your thesis. On the other side, I would say that there are so many factors that it could be, and I have seen it, but will I say less vine means less pathogens in the vineyard? No. The old vineyard tend to have less vine per area, and so this can be, yes, it could be, but so yes, but question mark for my point of view.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of evidence of there haven't been a lot of studies done looking at the relationship between vines that have the fungi, have the spore producing structures on them, and proximity to other infections or symptoms, for example. Like there, as plant pathologists, to test that hypothesis, we would have to go to the vineyard and find the vines that the spores are being produced from, and then look for the incidence of symptomatic vines around those vines. And I can think of one study on this, maybe on Eutypa, that was done in California by a colleague of mine who now studies corn diseases. But he went into vineyards that had Eutypa dieback, and he looked for the little tiny black dot fruiting structures. And then he went through and went back to that vineyard year after year after year and mapped out the vines that had symptoms. And he did find a relationship that the vines that had symptoms of Eutypa dieback, that were near vines that were producing the spores of the fungus, had were actually symptomatic. There was a correlation between those two. So anyways, the patterns we see of trunk diseases distributed out in the vineyard, though, you know, they're often relatively random. In the literature, that's how it's stated. That's generally my experience. I would say, with an exception, you know, in California, we see the trunk disease ESCA. Sometimes we do see that in localized areas within a vineyard. Sometimes those areas have some unique aspect to the soil, like there's, you know, you might be standing in very gravelly areas for whatever reason. And so that's where you see the disease symptoms more frequently on vines. That would be the only kind of non-random pattern of trunk diseases that I've seen in a vineyard.
We have another question that I think both of you relates to both factors, is if we have an infected trunk, can we bring up a new sucker for a new trunk? So let's say we've got an older vine, we want to do a rejuvenation, and we got two options. We can pull that vine, or if we have a healthy sucker come off above, or I guess if it's grafted above our union, is it likely to, I mean, you've got that whole root system to support it, so theoretically you should be able to catch it up quicker. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. The answer is yes, in terms of I really like to have a step-by-step approach, and I make some jokes about it. I mean, you start with a small weapon, a knife, then a pistol and rifle, and then the bomb. So progressively, if the vine, as we have seen also into the picture, we have seen that many times the pathogens get into the wound and start to crawl its way back into the trunk. Okay, so if the options are, I have a vine which is infected, okay, do I pull it or do I retrain it? I personally did some very beautiful on a whole field retraining from the trunk with a shoot to actually rejuvenate the vine. Again, try to prune, avoid the cut, and so on. So don't always start to, don't go to the last solution. Try to take all the steps in betweens, but why not to try to retrain the vine and to have an healthy vine that maybe it will last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That means 2, 3, 4, 5 yields, because you will have definitely a big root system that will feed the vine, and so it will be productive the same year or the following year. And then if even that gets sick, okay, you put it out. But as Kendra said, the fact of removing the vine because, okay, I am taking out inoculum from the vineyard on the balance of losing a vine which can be 2, 3, 4 year productive, I will tend to be more conservative.
Yeah, we've done some studies recently with this, we call this technique trunk renewal, but it's also been called vine surgery. Retraining a sucker from the base of the vine and cutting away the entire canopy. This has been done for many years. Many growers do this, and it's the thought of it is a good idea, in that you're cutting away an infected canopy. All the infection is in that woody canopy. If you cut that, get rid of that. As long as the vine isn't infected below the point where that cut is made, then it'll work, right? The risk, I think, is though that you're making a big wound, right? So that there's a big bullseye, so to speak, for a spore to land on. And so it would be important to maybe make those cuts during the growing season, or putting a pruning wound protectant on, and doing this only in dry weather if you must do this during the dormant season. Also, I wouldn't wait. The older the vineyard gets, the higher the risks are maybe of there being infections to the trunk also. And so, what you hate to see is when you make that cut on the trunk and then there's a wood canker there, or something. It's like, oh, great. I'm retraining not from healthy wood, but from wood that's already infected. So,
yeah. We'll finish on this question. We'll do a wrap up. Are there, let's see here. Let me go ahead. It was the one before. Would an angled cane cut with the cut faces away from the rain minimize spore access? Also, what are the best practices for bark grafting? So let's stick with the angled cut. Now, Marco, correct me if I'm wrong. Just horticultural pruning in general, angled cuts are typically bad. Now he's suggesting facing away from predominant rainfall winds, I guess, but that's a larger surface area for so.
Yes, I could make a joke, an Italian joke. When you cut a salami, you cut it in a diagonal way because you get the biggest slice. So if we learn today that bigger the surface, bigger the chance to get actually the spores, probably, in my opinion, the square cut, so to have a circular round with less surface, is the best strategy, instead of making a diagonal cut that actually present a bigger surface to pathogens than the other one.
Yep. Got any thoughts on bark grafting?
Bark grafting, help me out.
Well, a lot of time, I guess, changing vines from one cultivar or one variety to another.
We do it all around the world. I've seen it in California. We do it here, and it is a very interesting technique, and it works. So I'm positive about that, because even sometimes we need to change the variety due to the necessity of the winery. So from Cabernet, we need to go to Chardonnay, and so we need to make those changes. Absolutely. I've seen, actually, I was in California, that Tibad and many other, they have a 90+% ratio of success. So, I am...
Obviously, the common sense approach would just make sure it's on healthy wood, right? We're not doing
absolutely.
We're not doing this on a infected vine. Now, I will say, Kendra, for the folks in the South that deal with Pierce's disease, we have seen no success in retraining new vines by lopping off the old vine. That infection, if has potentially already made its way down, we just recommend to pull them. We do not. People have tried to do severe pruning cuts to take off those cordons, start fresh. But we've just not really found that to be successful. Folks in here may disagree with me, but we've had some vineyards here locally say, oh, well, maybe that infection is just in those cordons or just above the spurs and the canes. And if I just take all that off and start lay down new cordons, we'll be okay. And it never does. So a lot of times that infection has made its way too far down.
Yeah, Xylella, the bacterium that causes Pierce's disease, can move systemically throughout a vine. I mean, rarely is it distributed evenly throughout a vine that's infected, but it can make its way down into the permanent woody part of the vine for sure.
Well, I want to say one thing, and it's just kind of going back to the notes that we use to prep this, and we'll kind of conclude. First of all, while I'm saying these things, I hope our audiences enjoy the topic. It's a lot, right, to just scratch the surface within 55 minutes. But number one, just to kind of help the recording and know the audience that we're reaching, if you will put the state that you are representing, that would be great to know. Should have done that at the beginning. I think I failed to do that last time. But one thing as kind of a wrap up, the takeaways is, again, the windows. I like to go to the windows. You know, we talk about labor issues. We talk about, sometimes we just have to start when we can, whenever, because we know it's going to take X number of days to get through a block of vines. We have weather windows, we have labor windows, we have pathogen windows. I think we can relate that weather and pathogen pretty closely together since we learned how these spores translocate. And then we have these vine physiological windows. And as Marco has so eloquently put, we got to start when it's small, when they're young vines, make small cuts, proper decisions each and every year. Yeah, a lot of times we're really setting ourselves up for some potential future issues with infections if we're making these big cuts on older vines. And a lot of times we inherit problems. The turnover of ownership and managers in vineyards is sometimes often, and so you inherit previous issues. And that's where I just want to encourage the audience to tune in to ASEV stuff, ask these questions. We have specialists across the country who are working on these kind of things for their specific areas. Marco's a consultant, and he does great business across the globe. And if you haven't never signed up for one of his classes, I am going to take off my extension hat and put a plug in for Marco. You can get in touch with him if you need to through me. Be glad to share his information. The summary is pruning is not something that you would give anybody a set of shears to just take off. You've got to be educated. You've got to be trained. And so it's important, and I'm just preaching to the choir, I'm sure. It's important to have those educated people to have the time window to make the proper cuts and not being rushed. And we talked about in preparing for this session how important that is. You can make those hedge cuts easy, put somebody on a gas trimmer, a hedger, but to make those informed decisions of management from year to year, it's important you train your staff. Again, I just learned so much from Marco's class about managing that growth every year, managing the growth. So we are 4 minutes behind already. Last 10-second remarks, Marco, Kendra.
You said it well. My suggestion, really put your best people on pruning. Try to avoid the rain through the dormant season. Maybe start a little earlier than you used to do. In America, I mean, in Italy, we are almost with the shear ready to start. So try to avoid really to make the bad cut. See cut as wound and door for pathogens. That will, and share that thinking with the people in the vineyard. That will be the first step of a beautiful path.
Kendra?
Yeah, definitely avoid pruning in the rain. Do not prune in the rain, and do your best to prune during the driest period in the forecast for the weather. I would say too that like the cuts that are made very close to the cordon or the cane, those are always the greatest risk because there's the shortest distance between that cut surface and the permanent woody structure of the vine. And so if the fungi get into those, there's a greater risk of a permanent infection developing. But I would say too that it is worth from an IPM perspective, scouting for symptomatic vines. Just like you might be out there scouting for powdery mildew or bunch rots or insect pests. You can always learn by scouting for vines and, putting flagging tape around those that show symptoms. So it's not a bad idea to do that, to educate yourself on what's going on in your own vineyard.
Raymond keeps reminding us in the Pacific Northwest, it always rains. I'm sorry, Raymond.
Send it our way, please.
Yeah. Well, hey, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed it. We have one more, I will go one in November, session November, December. I don't even have it pulled up what the topics are, but just pay attention. We're trying to get the word out of this session once a month. It's been great fun. Thank you so much for everybody attending. Till next time, Marco from Italy, have a good evening. Go eat supper. The rest of us are going to go eat lunch. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.